Elizabeth, a loving grandmother who had always been the rock of her family, suddenly found herself in a frightening situation when she kept mysteriously falling out of her wheelchair. Her son Brian was beside himself with worry, unable to figure out why these accidents kept happening. But when he installed hidden cameras to get to the bottom of things, what he discovered would leave him heartbroken and change their family forever. How did this strong beloved grandmother become the victim of such a heartbreaking situation? And what shocking truth did Brian uncover that would change the way he saw his mother's pain? Stay tuned to find out, but before we dive in, let us know where you are watching from today, and if Elizabeth and Brian's emotional journey speaks to you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Elizabeth's life in Atlanta had always been active. She used to walk through her neighborhood, chatting with neighbors, and enjoying the vibrancy of the city. But after a stroke left her partially paralyzed, she had to rely on a wheelchair to get around. Her son, Brian, did his best to care for her, visiting often, and making sure she had everything she needed. Despite her condition, Elizabeth's spirit remained unbroken. However, things took a concerning turn when Brian noticed she was falling out of her wheelchair more frequently. Each time it happened, she brushed it off, but Brian's worry deepened with every new bruise. He installed safety features around the house, but nothing seemed to work. Every week, there was a new accident, and each time, Elizabeth's injuries worsened. Brian couldn't figure it out. Was his mother's health deteriorating more rapidly than they thought, or was something else happening? The incidents escalated. Elizabeth was now falling several times a week, often when no one else was around. Brian upgraded her wheelchair, thinking it was a mechanical issue, but the falls persisted. What was strange was that the accidents always happened in different areas of the house. Sometimes, it would be in the living room, other times near the front door. Each time, Elizabeth seemed confused, as if she couldn't understand how she ended up on the floor. Brian started to fear for his mother's safety. He noticed that Elizabeth's demeanor had changed too. She was more withdrawn, quieter than usual, and seemed to be avoiding certain parts of the house altogether. Something wasn't adding up. Fearing that something might be wrong with his mother's health, Brian took her to several specialists around Atlanta. Cardiologists, neurologists, physical therapists, all of them ran tests, but the results came back normal for a woman her age. The doctors reassured him that while Elizabeth's mobility had been compromised, there was no reason why she should be falling out of her wheelchair with such frequency. This only frustrated Brian further. If it wasn't a health issue, what was causing these accidents? He started to lose sleep, racking his brain for answers. Every time the phone rang, he feared it would be another call about his mother falling. Elizabeth had hired a new housekeeper, Gloria, to help her with daily tasks. Gloria was a middle-aged woman who had a reputation for being reliable, and Elizabeth had seemed happy with her at first. But Brian started noticing a strange tension between his mother and the housekeeper. Whenever Brian visited, Gloria seemed nervous, almost too eager to leave the room. There were moments when Brian could have sworn he saw Elizabeth stiffen whenever Gloria approached. At first, Brian dismissed it. He chalked it up to the stress of the situation. His mother's health was declining, after all, and that would make anyone irritable. But as the falls continued, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about Gloria. The nagging suspicion that something more sinister was happening in his mother's home kept Brian on edge. After sleepless nights of worrying about her safety, he made the difficult decision to install hidden cameras throughout the house. He placed them discreetly in the living room, kitchen, hallway, and near Elizabeth's bedroom, areas where most of the accidents seemed to happen. Brian didn't want to raise his mother's anxiety, so he kept the plan to himself. If something or someone was behind her falls, he was determined to catch them. After setting up the cameras, he checked the live feeds from his phone throughout the day, hoping for a normal, uneventful outcome. On the first night of recordings, Brian sat glued to the footage. The cameras captured Elizabeth's usual routine, watching her favorite soap operas, talking on the phone with one of her friends, and later, Gloria arriving to help her get ready for bed. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Brian felt relieved. Maybe it was just a coincidence, he thought. Maybe the falls were just unfortunate accidents. He went to bed that night feeling cautiously optimistic, but something deep down urged him to keep watching. He decided to let the cameras record for a few more days, just to be sure. On the third night, Brian's worst fears were confirmed. As he scrolled through the footage from the living room camera, he noticed something that made his stomach churn. Gloria could be seen entering the room late at night after Elizabeth had gone to bed. She walked quietly over to Elizabeth's wheelchair, glanced around nervously, and then, to Brian's horror, began loosening one of the bolts under the seat. Brian paused the footage, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Gloria, the woman entrusted with his mother's care, was sabotaging her wheelchair. The next morning, as Elizabeth tried to move herself from the living room to the kitchen, she lost her balance and tumbled to the floor. Gloria rushed in, feigning shock and concern. Rage surged through Brian as he watched the footage over and over again. He couldn't understand why Gloria would do such a thing. What possible reason could she have to harm his mother? With a heavy heart, Brian knew he had to confront her, but he wanted answers first. Brian couldn't wait any longer. The next day, after watching his mother closely and ensuring her safety, he called Gloria into the living room. He sat her down, trying to remain calm, but his fury was barely contained. Gloria seemed uneasy, sensing that something was wrong. "I've been watching the cameras," Brian said quietly, showing no emotion. The color drained from Gloria's face, and she immediately started to deny any wrongdoing. But when Brian pulled out his phone and played the footage of her tampering with the wheelchair, her defenses crumbled. Gloria broke down in tears, confessing that she had indeed been sabotaging Elizabeth's wheelchair. However, she insisted that she hadn't done it on her own. She claimed she was being blackmailed, forced into it by someone else who had their own agenda. Brian was stunned. The situation was far worse than he had imagined. When he pressed Gloria for more information, she revealed that Elizabeth's estranged niece, Vanessa, had coerced her into tampering with the wheelchair. Vanessa, a woman with a long-standing grudge against the family, had always felt wronged and left out of her share of the family inheritance. She believed that Brian would inherit everything when Elizabeth passed and saw this as an opportunity to stake her claim. Vanessa had promised Gloria a share of the money in exchange for making it seem like Elizabeth's health was rapidly declining. The plan was to convince Brian to put his mother into a nursing home, leaving the family home empty and easier for Vanessa to manipulate. Brian's mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Vanessa's visits had become more frequent lately, always under the guise of concern for her aunt's health. He remembered how his mother had tried for years to reconcile with Vanessa, only to be met with bitterness and greed. Brian spent the next few days piecing together the family's troubled past. Vanessa had always felt that her father, Elizabeth's brother, had been unfairly treated when it came to the family estate. When Elizabeth's parents passed, most of the property had gone to her, leaving Vanessa with a deep sense of resentment. Over the years, Vanessa's greed had festered, turning her into a person Brian barely recognized. Elizabeth, for her part, had tried multiple times to mend their relationship. She had invited Vanessa over for holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings, but Vanessa never fully accepted her olive branch. The final straw had come when Elizabeth sold a piece of the family land and used the money to help Brian pay for his home in Atlanta. Vanessa had taken that as a personal affront, convinced that she was being cut out of the family fortune. Brian now realized that Vanessa's visits over the past few months weren't out of genuine concern. She had been playing a long game, trying to wear down Elizabeth's health and push Brian into making decisions that would ultimately benefit her. Determined to protect his mother, Brian continued gathering evidence. He kept the cameras rolling, focusing on capturing more of Vanessa's interactions with Gloria and their suspicious conversations. He also began documenting Vanessa's frequent visits, noting how her demeanor had shifted from concern to barely concealed impatience whenever Elizabeth brought up her health. Brian knew that confronting Vanessa without solid evidence could backfire. She was manipulative and had always been good at twisting the truth. He needed undeniable proof to expose her scheme. Meanwhile, he distanced Gloria from his mother without raising too much suspicion. He didn't want Vanessa to catch wind of what he knew until he had all the information he needed. When Brian finally sat down with his mother to explain what he had uncovered, Elizabeth was devastated. She had always suspected that Vanessa harbored resentment, but she had never imagined it would go this far. The betrayal cut deep, and for the first time in years, Elizabeth broke down in front of her son. "How could she do this to me?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. "I raised her like my own daughter. I loved her." Brian comforted his mother, promising her that Vanessa's actions would not go unpunished. The conversation was difficult, but necessary. Elizabeth was hurt, but Brian knew they had to be strong to face what was coming. Vanessa, unaware of the cameras and the growing body of evidence against her, continued her visits. She sensed something was off when Gloria stopped taking her calls as often, but she brushed it aside. She remained focused on her goal of pushing Elizabeth into a nursing home. On one of her visits, Vanessa pressed Brian about Elizabeth's condition, subtly suggesting that maybe it was time to consider long-term care. Brian played along, pretending to be concerned, but inwardly, he was counting the days until he could confront her. Vanessa's arrogance was her downfall. She underestimated Brian's resolve and had no idea how much evidence he had collected against her. Brian waited until the perfect moment to confront Vanessa. He called a family meeting at Elizabeth's house, inviting Vanessa under the pretense of discussing his mother's health. When Vanessa arrived, she was her usual self, calm, collected, and ready to manipulate the situation. But Brian didn't waste any time. He played the footage of Gloria tampering with the wheelchair and presented the evidence of her communications with Vanessa. The room fell silent as Vanessa's face turned pale. For the first time, she had no words. Desperation kicked in as Vanessa tried to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Gloria, fearing legal consequences, testified against Vanessa, admitting to her part in the scheme. Vanessa had no choice but to confess. She tearfully admitted that she had felt trapped by her financial situation and had seen no other way out. With Vanessa exposed, Brian and Elizabeth began the long process of healing. Gloria was dismissed, and Vanessa faced legal action for her role in the sabotage and manipulation. The house no longer felt like a place of fear and uncertainty, and Elizabeth could finally relax, knowing her son was there to protect her. Though the emotional wounds were still fresh, Brian and Elizabeth grew closer than ever. They spent more time together, reminiscing about happier days and finding solace in each other's company. Vanessa's betrayal would always linger in their hearts, but their bond was stronger than any scheme or act of greed. Brian installed new security measures to ensure his mother's safety, but more than anything, he made a promise to never let anything like this happen again. In the end, they learned that family isn't just about blood, it's about trust, loyalty, and love.